is asked for a statement from the Secretary of State for Defence.
With permission, Madam Deputy Speaker, I wish to make a statement to update the House on the Middle East. And there's a lot to update, and I trust the House will understand. I want to start by praising our armed forces who are working 24/7 to protect British lives and British interests in the region. From our 400-strong air defence teams in Cyprus, who I visited last week, to our counter-drone specialists in Iraq, our fast jet pilots in Qatar, our command specialists in the regional defence coordination centres, and everyone working on this crisis abroad and at home. Iran threatens us all, but it's our forces who feel this most acutely. So I'm sure the whole House will join me in thanking them for their outstanding dedication and for their professionalism. For protecting British lives, for keeping us safe, we want to say to them, you are the best of Britain in action. Madam Deputy Speaker, the UK's government approach throughout the current developments in the Middle East is founded on three principles. First, defensive, taking the necessary action to strengthen our collective defence. So we took steps from January, weeks before this current war with Iran began, to pre-position Typhoons, F-35s, counter-drone teams, radars and defence in the region, as well as the additional military capability we've sent since last Saturday when the Iranian retaliation attacks started. Second, coordination with allies. We do not work alone, so we're leading and coordinating our response with NATO allies and other partners, including the US, E5 nations and the Gulf states. And I'm in daily contact with my counterparts, just as the Chief of Defence Staff is at 2. And third, Madam Deputy Speaker, our third principle is legal. We must have a legal basis for our decisions that allows ministers to make sound choices. It allows our military to operate with the fullest confidence. And our UK action is grounded in these principles to protect British people, protect British bases, to protect British allies. Now, Madam Deputy Speaker, in the last week, we've seen Iran lashing out with dangerous, indiscriminate and reckless strikes. In the first day alone, they attacked 10 countries with military and civilian targets attacked, including hotels in Dubai and Bahrain and the Kuwaiti National Airport. British troops stationed at a US base in Bahrain were within a few hundred yards of an Iranian strike, and a small drone hit our base in Cyprus coming from Lebanon or Iraq. And Iraq has now fired over 500 ballistic and cruise missiles and over 2,000 drones. Thank you to the Honourable Gentleman. Iran has now fired over 500 ballistic and cruise missiles and over 2,000 drones. I'm grateful to him for paying attention to my statement quite so closely. And even after the Iranian President's apology and promise to the Gulf states over the weekend, Iran still then struck multiple countries with drones and missiles, including Bahrain, where 32 civilians were injured in one attack and a desalination plant was hit in another. We totally condemn these attacks. They're putting hundreds of thousands of people at risk, including British nationals and members of our armed forces. But, Madam Deputy Speaker, while Iran's current indiscriminate strikes began last Saturday, this Iranian regime has for decades been a source of evil, exporting violence across the Middle East and beyond. It supplied nearly 60,000 Shahid drones to Putin for Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine. Here in the UK, they conduct aggressive cyber attacks against us and have plotted assassination on Britain's streets. The Iranian regime is a destructive force which has slaughtered protesters in its own streets and inflicts terrible suffering, especially against its own people. We want to see Iran stop their strikes, give up their nuclear ambitions and restart the negotiations. And as Defence Secretary, my number one priority is protecting British people, military and civilian alike. Since January, we've moved significant military assets into the region ahead of those first US-Israeli strikes. And those preparations made a real difference. It meant we've conducted defensive military operations from day one. Our F-35s destroying Iranian drones over Jordan. Our Typhoons shooting down targets heading to Qatar. Our counter-drone units defeating further attacks against coalition bases in Iraq. We acted early to protect British people and British interests and to support our allies. And as the Iranian response became clear from last weekend, we adapted our actions to the changing circumstances, driven at all times by military advice. So that's why we agreed a new US request for the use of British bases at RAF Fairford and Diego Garcia last Sunday. And that's why I committed further resources to the region last week, including 4 extra Typhoons, 3 Wildcat helicopters, a Merlin helicopter and HMS Dragon. And I can confirm today that Dragon will set sail in the next couple of days. And I want to personally thank all those who are working tirelessly, some 22 hours a day, to get that ship ready. Yeah. HMS Dragon will join US air defence destroyers to provide additional protection in the eastern Mediterranean. And Madam Deputy Speaker, let me also provide the House with the following operational update from last night. The UK is now conducting defensive air sorties in support of the UAE. Typhoons successfully took out 2 drones, one over Jordan, the second heading to Bahrain. The third Wildcat has now arrived in Cyprus, and we've now deployed additional RAF operations experts in more than 5 countries in the region, helping coordinate regional military and civilian airspace. And the fragments of that drone that hit at Cartlidge are being analysed for foreign military hardware by our experts at DSTL. British pilots have now racked up over 230 flying hours. We have 8 jets in Qatar, including our joint Qatari-British squadron, who are flying in support of regional allies, and we have more jets in Cyprus than any other nation. And I visited our 400-strong air defence teams at our base in Cyprus on Thursday last week. They're there in addition to the 4,000 personnel regularly stationed on the island. I was subjected to the daily air sirens that they face. I saw the impact that Iranian proxy drone had caused, and I asked the Commander of British Forces, General Tom Buick, "Do you need anything more from us back in Britain?" And he said to me, "No, I've been given everything I have asked for." The UK is leading this response to Iranian threats in close coordination with our allies. And Cyprus's head of the National Guard told me last week, our military cooperation has never been closer. And our support is backed up by our NATO allies, including the US, France, Greece and Germany, something I discussed with E5 defence ministers last week. And I can also confirm to the House that having given the US the go-ahead to use British bases for specific defensive operations into Iran last Sunday, the first US bomber landed at RAF Fairford on Friday. And as the Prime Minister has set out, this activity is part of, I quote, the collective self-defence of long-standing friends and allies and protecting British lives. It is in accordance with international law. These missions are to destroy Iranian missiles at source. And Madam Deputy Speaker, we are deeply concerned about escalation in Lebanon. Hezbollah is a dangerous terror organisation tied to the regime in Iran. It must cease these attacks against Israel. But we do not want to see Israel expand this conflict further into Lebanon. More than 400 have already been killed and 500,000 displaced by recent Israeli operations. The solution to these problems, to this conflict, must be guided by the Lebanese people and the Lebanese government. And we urge de-escalation and the return to a negotiated process. Now, I know, moving beyond defence, that many of us as MPs have constituents with friends and family that are caught in the region, worried for the safety of their loved ones. And my Right Honourable friend, the Foreign Secretary, and the FCDO teams are working as fast as possible to get our people out of the region. 3 chartered flights have now taken off, with more to come this week. More than 170,000 people have registered their presence, which has allowed us to get them information and support and advice that they need. More than 37,000 British nationals have been evacuated since the start of the crisis response, and as the Prime Minister said last week, we will not stop until our people are safe. Madam Deputy Speaker, these are deeply uncertain times. While we deal with the immediate crisis in the Middle East, we must also maintain our strong support for Ukraine, deter increasing threats in the High North, fulfil our NATO commitments, and ensure our homeland is protected. Our adversaries are watching. We must manage rising demands on defence, balancing resources to best effect. And we must also deal with the cost of living impact this conflict could cause, just as my Right Honourable friend the Chancellor has set out in her statement. I'm proud of the UK's response, acting at all times in our national interest. We will defend our allies, we will support our armed forces, we will do everything necessary to protect British lives and British interests, to make Britain secure at home and strong abroad. I commend
Shadow Secretary of State, James.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and can I thank the Secretary of State for advance sight of his statement and the briefing I received from his officials this morning. Can I begin by offering condolences on behalf of the opposition to the 7 US soldiers killed in action as part of their ongoing action against Iran. I join the Secretary of State in utterly condemning Iran's indiscriminate attacks across the region and in expressing my gratitude and that of the opposition to all our brilliant, brave service personnel and their families who are stationed out there. Of course, the Secretary of State and I will agree that the #1 responsibility of any government is to defend its people, and that everything possible must be done to secure our sovereign bases, particularly RAF Akrotiri on Cyprus, attacked by drones a week ago. That is an incredibly serious development. We support the government in taking steps to use the RAF and other assets to protect the airspace and defend against drone and missile threats to Akrotiri, but also in deploying our Air Force to defend allies in the region as an act of collective self-defence. The problem is this. Any serious integrated missile defence plan for the sovereign base areas on Cyprus would by necessity include the presence of one of our highly capable Type 45 air defence destroyers. And yet, despite the Secretary of State just saying, and I quote, since January, he has been moving military assets to the region. There isn't a single Royal Navy warship present, and our Type 45 HMS Dragon hasn't even set sail. Can he confirm that the government only decided last Tuesday to send a Type 45 to the Eastern Med after the US action had already commenced and 2 days after RAF Akrotiri was attacked by kamikaze drones? Of particular importance, Madam Deputy Speaker, it has been widely reported that the Royal Navy recommended to ministers weeks ago to deploy a Type 45 destroyer to the region. Is that true? And if so, when did the Navy make the recommendation to send a Type 45? And which minister took the decision to decline that advice from the Royal Navy and instead choose not to send a destroyer? Who? Most importantly, why was the decision taken not to send a Type 45 until attacks had already taken place against our base on Cyprus? And can the Secretary of State tell us on what date he expects HMS Dragon to be in position to provide air defence in the region? And furthermore, given the Chancellor's promise in her statement just now to reopen the Straits of Hormuz and France's pledge to provide escort ships, what other Royal Naval assets will we be sending to assist? This is a big one. Madam Deputy Speaker, it was on the 19th of February that the BBC reported that the United Kingdom would not allow the United States to use its bases to launch an attack on Iran. We know that 3 US Arleigh Burke destroyers, their equivalent of the Type 45, have for days been based in the Mediterranean, providing Cyprus with defence against ballistic missiles. Doesn't this mean that until the Prime Minister's U-turn a week ago, that this Labour government were displaying the most extraordinary double standards to our closest military ally, on the one hand denying the US the use of our bases, whilst on the other relying on them to protect ours? Exactly. One of the bases in question is Diego Garcia, Madam Deputy Speaker, absolutely critical for launching US heavy bombers. Now, it's bad enough for the Prime Minister to be U-turning over permission to use Diego Garcia whilst it is still our sovereign territory. How much worse will the situation be once we've started paying billions for the pleasure of Mauritius, a close ally of China, to have a say on whether such action complies with international law? So isn't it the case that when it comes to the Prime Minister's next and 17th U-turn, the best thing he could do is to scrap his crazy Chagos deal and spend every penny on the British Armed Forces? But this isn't just about the future of Diego Garcia. Last week, the Cypriot Foreign Minister said, and I quote, "There are questions about the future of the UK's military bases on the island." Isn't the reality that Greece, France and Spain are all sending ships, and that Labour's failure to deploy the Royal Navy to the Eastern Mediterranean has completely undermined our international standing, not just in the eyes of our many allies in the Middle East, but also in the eyes of those who can now exploit such weakness? So can the Secretary of State give his cast-iron guarantee that UK sovereignty of our bases on Cyprus is not up for negotiation? Madam Deputy Speaker, of course, it's not just HMS Dragon that everyone is waiting for. At a time of war on multiple fronts, we've now been waiting months and months for the government to publish its long-overdue defence investment plan. I cannot emphasise how serious this is. Britain urgently needs to rearm. It was right that we gave a huge amount of munitions to support Ukraine, but that has made our need to rearm even more pressing. Correct. So when exactly is the government going to publish the defence investment plan? Can the Secretary of State at least say if it will be published before local election purdah commences? That is a key question. Finally, isn't there a simple reason why there's no defence investment plan? And isn't it the same reason that for the first time in almost half a century there are no Royal Navy warships in the Middle East? Because when it comes to defence spending, this government has prioritised welfare over rearmament. Yes. They've chosen to spend billions more on benefits rather than strengthening our defence in a dangerous world. So, Madam Deputy Speaker, after all the Prime Minister's dither and delay, U-turns and weakness, will the Secretary of State finally demand from his Chancellor what we all know our armed forces need, a properly funded plan to get to 3% on defence this Parliament?
Secretary of State.
Well, let me start by recognising the fact that he supports the steps that we've taken to put UK defence capabilities into the Middle Eastern region, that his recognition and support for the fact we did this in advance of the current crisis, and these capabilities and our coordination of them have been alongside US allies and have been purely defensive in nature. We have been doing what Britain can best contribute to the protection of British interests, British personnel, British bases and British allies in the region. He asks me about Dragon. Well, we've been building up that significant military presence in the Middle East since January, which he, for the first time, has recognised and welcomed. It is totally right that as circumstances change, so should our military posture. He asks me when this option of Dragon was first put to ministers. As the Chief of the Defence Staff said on the BBC on Saturday, he looked at the proposals for Dragon being deployed to the Middle East on Tuesday last week and I signed them off the same day. And I say to the right honourable gentleman, if he is unhappy about the state of the British Navy, he should take a hard look at his government's own record. Over 14 years, they hollowed out and underfunded our forces. They cut £12 billion from the defence budget in their first 5 years. Total frigate and destroyer numbers were cut from 23 to 17. And in 14 years in government, they didn't order a single new destroyer. Madam Deputy Speaker, we only have Dragon available to go to the Middle East today because the Labour government commissioned it before 2010. And I'm proud of the work our military are doing in the Middle East. I reject claims about the response. We've got ahead of the first strikes in the way that we've set. And I've been unable to find any evidence, in public or in this House, of the Shadow Defence Secretary calling at any stage for military assets to be moved to the Middle East before the war began. Indeed, the Shadow Foreign Secretary, barely a month ago in this House, was saying in this chamber, calling for our military, and I quote, to prioritise or repurpose inventory to contribute to NATO's high North missions. He really is proving himself quite an armchair general. General hindsight, wise only after the event. And I'm really disappointed. He asked about the dip. We're working flat out to produce that. He asked about defence spending. He cut it. We invested in defence. We're rising the greatest increase in defence spending since the end of the Cold War. This year alone, we're spending £62 billion on defence. That is £8 billion more than the last year of their government. And I'm really disappointed, and I tell you our forces are disappointed, that he did not stand up and offer an apology for what his leader said on Friday. His leader's claim that British forces in the Middle East are just hanging around is totally wrong and deeply insulting. They are working flat out in the face of air raid sirens and warnings to protect British lives, protect British interests, protect British allies, and it's time the Tories did the decent thing, apologised for her remarks and withdrew them.
Chair of the Select Committee, Tanmanjeet Singh Dhesi.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I thank the Defence Secretary for advance sight of his statement and his operational briefing before. And I also want to pay tribute and praise our armed forces for their bravery, dedication and professionalism to defend our citizens and our allies in the region. I agree with the Defence Secretary that we must urge de-escalation and a return to the negotiation process. And I also am glad that the government pre-positioned Typhoons, F-35s, counter-drone units and other air defence assets into the region. But the lack of a naval presence should be a cause of huge concern for all of us. I appreciate the Secretary of State's comments that our armed forces are significantly overstretched from the high north to further beyond, and that the hollowing out in recent years has meant that we do not have enough assets. But what is being done to urgently rectify the situation and increase the investment into defence in the near future so that we can be in several places all at once?
I'm grateful for my honourable friend's support for the action that we've taken, the deployments that I've decided to commit to the region. He asks about what are we doing to make good 14 years of our armed forces being hollowed out and underfunded under the previous government. The first step to is increased defence spending. This year, more than £8 billion greater than the last year that the previous government was in. £270 billion in this Parliament alone, the single biggest increase in defence spending since the end of the Cold War, and a defence investment plan that will follow up the Strategic Defence Review, a vision and a plan for rebuilding our forces, strengthening our deterrent, integrating our armed forces for the future, and harnessing the accelerating power of new technology, something that I'm grateful to he and his Defence Committee members for supporting and recognising.
Yeah. Lib Dem spokesperson James MacCleary.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. May I thank the Secretary of State for advance sight of his statement today and echo his praise for the bravery and professionalism of our armed forces putting their lives on their line for us all. The Liberal Democrats continue to have grave concerns about the UK being dragged into Trump's illegal war. However, it is fair to say that the situation has evolved very quickly. So given that it is commonplace for UK personnel to serve aboard US Navy ships, including aircraft carriers like those currently engaged in attacks on Iran, can the Secretary of State provide assurance to this House that no UK personnel are currently serving aboard US Navy ships engaged in offensive operations in the Middle East? Furthermore, there have been serious questions raised about the use of UK bases for US airstrikes. So can the Secretary of State reassure the House on what monitoring is in place to ensure that US actions from UK bases remain purely defensive? And will the government ensure that any intelligence relating to US strikes conducted from UK bases is provided to the Intelligence and Security Committee for review? And if UK bases were used, proposed to be used for offensive action beyond the government's authority, would the government withdraw permission immediately? Securing these guarantees is essential to ensure that the UK doesn't become complicit in Trump's unilateral and illegal war. Finally, Madam Deputy Speaker, even if the limited defensive actions carried out being asked for armed forces have exposed the stretched resources really are. So I must press the Secretary of State to give a clear time frame for the release of the Defence Investment Plan to start the urgent task of plugging these gaps. We must make sure that UK forces are given all the tools they need to do the jobs we ask of them, both now and in the future.
Madam Deputy Speaker, as I said to the House in my statement, all decisions that we've taken, all actions in the face of this current conflict have been defensive in nature and legally well-based. That gives a sound foundation for ministers' decisions. It gives the forces personnel the fullest confidence in the actions they're taking. That is true of those that we've got deployed in the region. It will be true of those that we have embedded, I'm proud to say, in the US forces around the world. And I'm proud, Madam Deputy Speaker, that our US-UK relationship remains deep and close, and that we continue to do things together that no other nations will do.
Emma Lewell.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Secretary of State is right that our armed forces are the very best of us. Australian and British media are reporting that HMS Anson has departed Western Australia ahead of schedule. Can my right honourable friend indicate whether HMS Anson will play a role in defending British interests in the region on her voyage home?
Madam Deputy Speaker, there are certain things that I will not and cannot disclose publicly, and the operations of our submarines fall into that category. My honourable friend is a long-standing member of the Defence Select Committee. I know she will understand the sensitivity and the potency of our submarine fleet. I know she asks the question, but she cannot realistically and reasonably expect the answer, and I know she knows that.
Lincoln Jopp.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I thank the Secretary of State for his statement? At that dispatch box about half an hour ago, perhaps unwisely, the Chancellor of the Exchequer delved into the world of military strategy, and she said a couple of things which were slightly alarming. Firstly, she upbraided, actually, the Shadow Chancellor for not calling for the de-escalation of the operations against Iran, and yet the Defence Secretary's own statement only mentions de-escalation when it comes to the situation in Lebanon. So could he just clarify whether he is calling on his American counterparts to de-escalate in Iran or not? And secondly, she said that in order to open the Straits of Hormuz, we would need to support something she called cross-country operations with France and the US, and that we were ready to do that to open the Straits of Hormuz. Could he comment on that too, please?
Madam Deputy Speaker, we as the UK Government are urging Iran to de-escalate. We are deeply concerned about regional stability, and part of the reason for our coordinated defensive actions, the contribution that we're making in the regional coordination centres, but also with our jets flying in defence of Middle Eastern allies, is to reinforce regional security and stability. Now, my honourable friend, the Chancellor, made an important statement this afternoon and included the commitment that she can confirm she'd approved for the Ministry of Defence access to the Special Reserve to deploy additional capabilities as they're needed to the Middle East. I'm sure the House will welcome that, as they will welcome the fact that she said, I'm committed to giving our military the resources they need.
Fred Thomas.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I strongly welcome my right honourable friend's leadership at this time. One of the defining characteristics of the UK's response to the crisis when Russia full-scale invaded Ukraine in 2022 was the political unity that this party offered our country in that response. So does my right honourable friend find it extremely disappointing to find the Leader of the Opposition saying that our military are hanging around when they are putting themselves in harm's way to defend our interests abroad? And does he expect, like I do, the Opposition Secretary of State to perhaps apologise for that really disappointing, cheap political point scoring?
My honourable friend is entirely right. When I had the honour of spending part of Thursday with our personnel on our base in MacCleary, it wasn't just the teams and the pilots flying the fast jets that are working flat out. The F-35 team I spoke to had deployed at 5 days' notice to Cyprus. It was the whole military personnel on that base, including those looking after and ensuring the relocation of non-essential personnel and families to hotels in the Pathos area. Madam Deputy Speaker, nothing could be further from the truth. Nothing could be more insulting than the suggestion that they're simply hanging around in the Middle East. And I really would like to hear, we didn't hear it from the Shadow Defence Secretary, any of the honourable members on the benches opposite contest what their leader has said, apologise on her behalf, and let's have the sort of support that recognises our armed forces are in the region to protect British personnel, to protect British bases, to protect British interests, and we're proud that they're doing that job.
Sir Julian Lewes.
I'm not particularly keen on the tone of these exchanges, so may I make a positive suggestion to the Secretary of State? We've heard that Ukraine has offered to assist the United States with its specialised version of anti-Iranian drone technology. Yep. These weapons for bringing down Iranian drones are much cheaper than the drones themselves, whereas the weapons which the Americans and ourselves generally use are much more expensive. Given the difficult relationship between Zelensky and Trump, does the Secretary of State agree that there is a role here for Britain, with its high standing in Ukraine, to see if we can't make a start by acquiring from Ukraine some of these weapons, which we can use in defence of our own bases, and which may then pave the way for a deal between Trump and Zelensky for the wider benefit of the whole theatre?
Madam Deputy Speaker, if we take this one step at a time, and I appreciate the Right Honourable Gentleman's suggestion and the tone in which he offers his thoughts. First of all, he, like I, will welcome President Zelensky's declaration that Ukraine stands ready and is offering their experience and their expertise to Gulf states facing many of the same Shahid Iranian drones. We are playing our part. We have the Defence Special Advisor for the Middle East at the moment doing a series of visits to 9 Gulf countries with a team that includes British experts in the Ukrainian fight against Putin's invasion and the technologies they've been using in order to defeat many of Putin's developments and drones. And the Minister for Defence Readiness and Industry is also talking to British firms about the contribution that they could make to supplying the reinforced defences that our Middle Eastern partners so badly need.
Please, can I encourage members to ask short questions and the Secretary of State to give briefer answers. Paul Waugh.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I shed no tears for the demise of an Iranian regime which murdered and repressed tens of thousands of its own citizens, particularly women. But I'm proud that this government has not joined the US and Israel in this reckless war, which lacks a clear plan and which is hitting my constituents in the pocket and is threatening the global economy. Given that this government has its own independent foreign policy, it's not the handmaiden of Washington, as the Tories would want it, and nor is it the poodle of Putin, as Reform are. But can the Defence Secretary now tell me how important it is that the Chancellor is providing new funds for our armed forces who are defending British interests and British citizens in the region?
I do indeed, Madam Deputy Speaker. My honourable friend is right to underline the statement and the commitment the Chancellor made this afternoon to this House. He's also right to point out that the US may be our closest ally, but as the Prime Minister has said, it is for the Prime Minister and the British Government to decide what is in Britain's best national interests.
I thank the Secretary of State for his statement. I listened very carefully to what he had to say about the authorisation of the US using UK bases and his confirmation that there are UK personnel embedded with US operations in the region. With that in mind, it seems all the more important that this government is entirely clear on the limits of the consent it has given to operating with the US. Defence Secretary Hesketh on Monday last week mocked the idea of rules of engagement and said he wanted to seek, and I quote, maximum lethality. President Trump then on Saturday said that new areas and groups of people would be under serious consideration for complete destruction. What confidence does the Secretary of State have that the US are following the same rules of engagement that he believes are legal for the UK?
Madam Deputy Speaker, I have the fullest confidence. These arrangements for access, basing and overflight are well established. The relations between the US and the UK are very close. We have operated these together before. We are doing so now.
Peter Swallow.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I thank the Defence Secretary for all that he is doing to support our troops in the region and protect British citizens? It is clear that a long conflict would pose real risks not only to them but also to energy prices and the cost of living here in the UK. So can I ask him, does he agree that we need to see urgent de-escalation and a reduction in tensions across the region? And does he share my concern that the Conservatives and Reform would see us dragged into a conflict that can have such devastating consequences for British lives and livelihoods?
Madam Deputy Speaker, my honourable friend makes important points, and when the first concern of this government, and I welcome his support for this, is the protection of British personnel, British citizens in the wider Middle East, our bases and our allies. I know he will support the action that we've taken, both before this current conflict broke out and in the week or so since. Thank you.
Dr. Andrew Murrison.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Isn't the problem here not our military capability? We still have the second most capable navy in NATO. It is political will. Why is it that HMS Duncan is alongside in Portsmouth, having spent the summer in a maintenance period, the sister ship of HMS Dragon? She has been up and ready to go for weeks. And why is it the case that she wasn't sent at the beginning of this crisis?
Well, the Honourable Gentleman's another former minister in the previous government in the Defence Department. He knows all about the decisions that have left our Navy in the state that it's in now. But he will also appreciate that we've taken decisions to deploy the things that Britain can best put into the region to protect our allies and to protect our people, both military and civilian. He will recognise and applaud the fact that because of that, from day one, our fast jets have been flying defensive operations in coordination with our allies and our US colleagues, and that where the circumstances change, we will adapt the action and the decisions that we take, which is just what we've done from the point that we saw the indiscriminate extent of the Iranian response last Saturday.
Peter Prinsley.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Iran has a network of proxies and lone actors who threaten security here at home. Will the Minister join me in thanking all the volunteers of the Community Security Trust who protect our Jewish places of worship and schools? Never have they been more crucial.
I will indeed. My honourable friend is right. The Community Security Trust does extraordinary work in very difficult times and is responding to deep unease and deep concern and in some cases serious fears amongst the Jewish community in this country.
Sir Roger Gale.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. May I first say that I don't know of anybody on these benches that would not wish to associate themselves with the Secretary of State's praise for the courage and determination of our armed services, both worldwide and particularly in Cyprus. I have to declare an interest, Madam Deputy Speaker, as you know, as an honorary citizen of Cyprus. The Republic of Cyprus has maintained a principle of neutrality, and that has served British nationals and others well over many years. Akrotiri is based exactly almost between Paphos and Larnaca. It's a very difficult situation for the Secretary of State to square. Could he tell the House what steps will be taken to protect those many British nationals resident in Cyprus and those many other British visitors who hitherto have gone to the island for their holidays?
I'm grateful to the honourable gentleman's remarks about our armed forces, and I will ensure that those are passed on. I hadn't realised he was an honorary citizen of Cyprus, and I hope he will appreciate in my statement I confirmed that the head of the National Guard confirms that cooperation between our militaries has never been closer, and I hope he'll appreciate that the defensive capabilities and activities that we are running from Akrotiri are part not just of defending our base, but defending our people right across Cyprus and the island of Cyprus itself. And from that island, we can also and are help defend regional allies.
Alex Baker.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I want to say thank you to the Secretary of State for everything that he is doing to support all of my constituents in the region and keep them safe. I know that he and I share a priority that we need to get our serving personnel the capabilities that they need. In the light of the movements we have seen today in the gilt and the bond markets, which underline the pressure of governments to finance increased defence spending, does the Secretary of State agree that we should explore innovative multilateral financing mechanisms, such as the Defence Security and Resilience Bank, to help unlock the capital our defence industrial base needs to grow?
I do, and we are. And my honourable friend will also have noted the Prime Minister's important speech in the Munich Security Conference a couple of weeks ago, when he recognised in this new era of threats that we face, this is now an era of hard power, and that he has recognised the need to spend more and faster on defence.
Stuart Anderson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I visited the UK-US Bahrain base at the end of last year, and on the 5th of January this year in the Venezuela statement, I said that we were exposed in Bahrain with the naval assets. The Secretary of State has rightly said from the January they've ramped up the UK presence over there. If last Tuesday was the first that the Chief of the Defence Staff saw a request for naval assets to go to that region, what has gone wrong during that time, and is this a strategic failure to take that long to put those assets on that desk?
Madam Deputy Speaker, I've explained to the House the range of defensive capabilities that we put into the region ahead of this current conflict. When we saw the scale of the Iranian reaction to the strikes, the retaliation from Saturday onwards, it was clear we needed to do more, and I have, and I've explained that to the House. I've also explained that these aren't just British defensive assets deployed on a fully legal basis. These are deployed in full coordination with our US and other allies. And HMS Dragon, as I've explained, will take up its position in the Eastern Mediterranean alongside other defensive destroyers that the US has already deployed in the area.
Alex Ballinger.
Mr. Speaker, the Shadow Secretary of State laments the state of our Royal Navy, but he will remember that it was his party that cut investment in our Royal Navy over 14 years, cut the size of a number of warships we had by 25%, and ordered no new destroyers in that period either. So does the Secretary of State agree that we should be investing in our Navy, but we should take no lessons from the party opposite that set up our Navy ready to fail in the situation we're in now?
I do agree, Madam Deputy Speaker, with my honourable friend, and we are, just as we are increasing the defence investment across the board, including in the munitions that we need when we're faced with conflicts like this.
Members will have noticed that there's still a lot of people on their feet. I'm aiming to finish this statement around 1:15. I call Richard Ford.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Secretary of State made the distinction between permitting the use of British bases for offensive and defensive action. I understand the need to protect and defend British citizens in the Middle East, but can the Secretary of State explain how he is seeking to maintain this distinction between offensive and defensive action, given it would require a degree of control over US military activity that the British government may not possess?
Well, the honourable gentleman is a military man by experience. He will understand the nature of the agreements, the requests that nations make of each other, the agreements that they put in place and how those work. Access, basing, overflights, which is exactly the request that we had when it was clear the Iranian response to the first wave of attacks took us into a new phase. That was a request from the US that we allow US bombers to operate from Fairford and Diego Garcia for specific defensive purposes, and that is to take out the Iranian missile positions, and that's what they are doing.
Calvin Bailey.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. It was a Conservative 2010 Strategic Defence and Security Review and subsequent basing review that took the Royal Navy's repair facilities from 3 to 1, an utterly reckless decision that was made worse when you knew of the power plant problems for Type 45, which you created an internal competition for the limited resource, Madam Deputy Speaker, that they created for the Royal Navy. Does the Secretary of State agree with me that it was both reckless Tory risk-taking which left the Royal Navy in this precarious situation?
Questions have to be shorter. Secretary of State.
I do agree with my honourable friend, Madam Deputy Speaker. He speaks with the authority of someone who was serving at the time in 2010, when in that first year they cut £2 billion from the defence budget, and in those first 5 years they cut £12 billion from defence. They underfunded and hollowed out our armed forces over 14 years.
Ben objecting.
The appointment of HMS Dragon means that we've left a gap in our commitment to be the flagship of the NATO Standing Naval Maritime Group 1 commitment. HMS Duncan's already tasked to go on Operation Firecrest to the High North, and HMS Dauntless is still in the fleet time support period. So can the Secretary of State guarantee that we will be able to fulfil our commitment to NATO in providing the flagship role, and can he guarantee that it will be provided by a British ship?
Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm not going to announce in advance the deployments that the British forces make. He's right to point to the balance of threats and responsibilities that we have to manage. We are doing that, and we will always fulfil our NATO commitments.
Rachel Taylor.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And can I thank my right honourable friend for everything he's doing in Britain's national interest. But our armed forces cannot believe their ears, with the leader of the opposition saying that they're hanging around doing nothing, and the honourable member for Clacton swanning off to the States to tell Donald Trump that if he were Prime Minister, he'd blindly follow the US defence policy. Does my right honourable friend agree with me that the first duty of any Prime Minister and any Secretary of State for Defence is our national interest, the Britain's national interest, and not anything else?
The first duty of any government is to defend the country, to pursue our national interest and to support our armed forces. On this occasion, we had expected and we looked for better from the Leader of the Opposition.
Chard.
I've only been in the House 21 years, but whenever we talk about defence and when our armed forces are in harm's way, I have to say a blame game on either side is not going to save a single life. And whilst we all want to see de-escalation, I think the government, I hope, will have learnt lessons in the last few weeks and months to prepare for escalation. So is the Defence Secretary aware of the 2024 report by the US Director of National Intelligence that underlines the stockpiles of chemical and biological weapons that Iran holds? And would he work with friends and allies in the region and with the new Syrian government to identify those stockpiles and deal with them? And finally, on MacCleary and other bases in the region, to ensure that our armed forces personnel and their families are given the right protective CBRN kit?
Madam Deputy Speaker, I am aware of the 2024 report that he cites. We are aware of those risks, and I say to the House, the Right Honourable Gentleman puts his 21 years as a member of this House to good effect in the comments that he makes this afternoon.
Imran Hussain.
Deputy Speaker, we should be deeply alarmed at the sight of US bomber jets arriving at UK military bases ahead of joining President Trump bombing Iran. These attacks violate international law. The suggestion that these aircraft would be used only for defensive purposes is frankly absurd. Their deployment risks dragging Britain into unlawful attacks and the loss of further civilian life. So can the Minister explain what assurances he can give this House that UK bases will not be used to facilitate further unlawful attacks and that Britain will not be dragged deeper into an illegal war that the majority of the British public do not support?
British bases will be used by American aircraft for fully lawful defensive purposes spelt out in the agreement that we have with the US, and that is to destroy Iranians' missile bases that are holding such indiscriminate risk and threat to our personnel and our allies in the region.
Savile Roberts.
Protecting livelihoods and limiting the cost of living hit both depend on President Trump ending his war of choice. I doubt whether he cares a jot about the damage he's doing to our economy, but he does care about his poll numbers. Does the Secretary of State agree, therefore, that it is a matter of national security that every method is used to make clear to the President how his reputation prior to the midterms is best served by bringing this crisis to a speedy conclusion?
Well, the last thing that the Honourable Lady is going to find me doing is sort of commenting on American political affairs. What she will find me doing as Defence Secretary is putting first and foremost the protection of British people, military and civilians, protection of British bases and the protection of British allies for front and centre, and that's what I'm doing.
Mohammed Yazin.
Madam Deputy Speaker, US and Israeli strikes on Iran have pushed the region into deeper instability. Over thousands of civilians, including children, have been killed. Britons remain stranded, and the shock to fuel prices is already being felt at home. The government was right not to join this illegal war, but will the Secretary of State hold the line against the drumbeat for escalation, act only to defend British citizens and national security within international law, and not enter an offensive war without the consent of this House.
My honourable friend will have heard me say in my statement and in response to other questions, the principles on which the decisions we've taken are based. Those are principles that will continue to inform any future decisions that we take as circumstances in this conflict may change.
Sir Ian Duncan-Smith.
Madam Deputy Speaker, nobody supports the armed forces more than I do, and he has my full support and my respect, as he knows. But I do want to ask this simple question. There seems to be some confusion, it seems to me, on the government backbenches, that somehow the government has kept them out of this war. The government has not kept Britain out of this war because we are in the firing line in our bases and our allies. And so can he now confirm to me that when the Chancellor stood up and talked about the Straits of Hormuz and the necessity of taking action where it's applicable, that the UK will and in international law can take action against threats to oil tankers and other facilities in the Straits of Hormuz by the Iranians?
Madam Deputy Speaker, we will take the action we need to defend British interests and British personnel and British civilians. He's right to say that our personnel are at risk. He puts it in the firing line. And I'm incredibly proud of the work that they're doing, not just to protect our bases and each other, but to protect our allies in the region and to lead the coordination of defensive operations that help keep the Middle East safe in the face of these Iranian attacks.
Damien Egan.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Targeting of RAF MacCleary by Iranian proxies represents a direct act of aggression against the United Kingdom. The Iranian regime has repeatedly shown its willingness to export terror internationally and across multiple fronts. May I ask what steps the Secretary of State is taking with colleagues across government to ensure that Iran poses less of a threat to Britons abroad and here in the UK?
Well, our first priority is British citizens in the region at present, which is why my right honourable friend, the Foreign Secretary, and her team are working so hard to advise and help Britain bring Brits back. My priority is to protect our forces personnel and to ensure that they can play their role in protecting the allies that we've got in the region, our British citizens that are there, and the recognition that many people have friends and family that may be stranded in the Middle East, concerned about their future, and I'm incredibly proud of the role that our armed forces are playing in doing just that.
Rebecca Smith.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. We all agree how important it is we protect our overseas bases and personnel deployed on operations. This must include the Ukraine. Over the weekend, the MOD posted a video on social media from a British-run military repair facility in Ukraine. It has been taken down, reportedly, as it revealed the geolocation of the sensitive site. So can the Secretary of State confirm if this is indeed correct and reassure the House that it won't happen again, either in relation to the Ukraine, the Middle East or anywhere else in our facilities?
Madam Deputy Speaker, we've taken that video down through an abundance of caution. The last thing that I and the British government would want to do and will allow to happen is to put Ukrainians at risk. And the last thing that I will do is to ensure that the steps we take in our support of Ukraine, just as we are doing in support of our allies in the Middle East, reflects our national interests, reflects our duty to protect our own people.
Steve Race.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Talking to people in Exeter over the weekend, there was very strong support for the government's current position of defending British citizens and assets, and at this point not going further. But does the Minister agree with me that this government's work to increase defence spending and commitment to new assets, including the new medium-haul helicopter programme in partnership with Leonardo in the southwest, safeguarding hundreds of jobs in our region, stands in stark contrast to the record of the government opposite?
I do indeed, Madam Deputy Speaker. This isn't just a contract that will secure actually well over 3,000 jobs for the future. It creates opportunities for many more in the years ahead. This isn't just a contract to build new medium helicopters in Yeovil. Leonardo has made the commitment to make Yeovil and the UK its global centre for the development and export of military helicopters, and it is also going to be the global centre of their development of helicopter autonomy for the future. It reinforces and is a great vote of confidence in Britain's innovation and industrial base.
Ayub Khan.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I mean no discourtesy to the Secretary of State, but there was an omission in his statement, a statement the last 10 minutes, and that was the murder of 165 young children at a school. And that target, allegedly, by a Tomahawk cruise missile and a double-tack strike. This government talks about calling out war crimes, in particular violence against women and girls. This does very little in trying to support that proposition. Will the Secretary of State condemn that attack? And would he like to explain what he has done in terms of talking to his alleged allies about this particular strike?
Secretary of State.
Well, the honourable gentleman will note, of course, that we only have the reports from the Iranian regime about that strike, and he will be aware that the US is looking into this at present.
Dr. Scott Arthur.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And I do want to start by paying tribute to Edinburgh's Iranian community. Despite being concerned about their family in Iran, they've taken time in the past week to host public events which share details of Iran's rich culture and also, I have to say, the barbaric nature of its regime. But I do want to ask a question about HMS Dragon, when I think the maths is quite clear. The ship cost £1 billion. The party opposite cut the defence budget by £14 billion. Surely, Secretary of State, if the party opposite wants to see more destroyers in the Mediterranean, they should have built the things.
Secretary of State.
Well, my honourable friend is right to pay tribute to the Iranian community in his home city of Edinburgh, and I reinforce and echo his comments. He's also right, of course, about the party opposite. 14 years and they didn't commission a single new destroyer, and we only have HMS Dragon set to sail this week in the next couple of days because it was commissioned by the previous Labour government.
Final question, Luke Taylor.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. Trump and Netanyahu's illegal war on this Iranian regime has shocked and disgusted our constituents, just like the Iranian regime's crackdowns on opposition protests for decades. The horrors that we've seen reinforce the feeling in this country that international events are happening to us, and since Brexit and since Trump re-entered the White House, we have much less say in our future and our security. So can I ask the Minister if he will listen to Liberal Democrat calls to empower us to take back control of our fate by issuing defence bonds to raise the cash we need to meet our defence spending, but also rebuild our place in Europe with deeper cooperation with our European neighbours to reduce our dependence on the mad king in the White House?
Secretary of State.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm always interested in ways of getting more funding into defence, and it's one of the reasons that I've laid such stress, not just on the record increase of defence investment that this government is making from the public purse, but ways that we can also leverage that with investment from private sources. And it's why we've got a defence finance advisory group that will shortly set out their report with proposals that we can pursue on that too.
That concludes the statement. Point